next guest was a photographer on the road with the Rolling Stones during the 1960s when the band was in its heyday. The intimate pictures he took provide fascinating insight into what life was like for the band on stage and off. Gered Mankowitz joins me now. I mean, these pictures are truly amazing, capturing the band when they're not really expecting it. You must have had a very good relationship with them to get that kind of access.
I did. It felt like I was one of the band.
Wow, okay. So was that kind of as rock and roll as we would imagine it would be?
It was pretty wild, and it was quite hard work, and it had moments of pure boredom, but it was overall fantastic.
Right. Anything off limits in your shooting of them?
No, nothing at all off limits.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at some of the photos that we can see, because these are all coming out in a book, many of these unpublished until now. Why is that?
It's because the volume of the archive is huge. It's over 5,000 images, and so I've only been able to publish a relatively small number up until now. And this new book, Backstage, gave me an opportunity to try and include 60–70% that had never been seen before.
Right. It must have been very different then to being on the road with a band today, I guess, because they were sort of one of the first super huge rock star groups, weren't they? We'd had the Beatles, of course, but were there just a huge number of groupies following them around the whole time?
It was pretty early days as far as groupies were concerned. The groupies who were around were strictly amateurs, sweet and lovely, but actually quite innocent. So it wasn't really as wild as it got. It got pretty wild, I think, in late 66 and 67,
right.
But by that time, I'd stopped working with them on the road.
Okay.
But in 65, it was exciting and it was a great adventure, but there wasn't a huge amount of wild rock and roll orgiastic sex.
Right.
There was a lot of music and there was a lot of fun, but not a huge amount of sex.
Wow, okay. I think that's probably more scandalous than if you told me there had been somehow. That's like, it's a totally different life to what I'd imagined the Rolling Stones were earlier. Yeah. We've got a scoop. So why did they want all these photos taken then over that period?
Well, that's a bit of a mystery. I mean, one of the reasons I think they took me on tour was because the Beatles had taken their own photographer on tour at the end of 64, early 65. And so I think it was partly because they wanted to be seen to be in a similar league to the Beatles. So if they took a photographer, then the Stones would take a photographer, and fortunately that was me.
One of the centerpieces in this exhibition in this collection rather, is the reinterpretation of your 1965 passport photographs of the band.
Yes, it sounds so funny.
Yeah, tell me about that and why you did it.
Well, my first session was very early in 65 in my studio, which was in Mason's Yard, which is only about 10 minutes walk from here where we are now. And at the end of the session, which had gone really fabulously well and had been great fun and felt terrific, I was suddenly asked by their manager to knock off some passport pictures for their new visas to go to. And I got into a complete and utter panic, having spent all day with the band, having shot them a dozen different ways. I suddenly got into a complete panic because I thought, well, these have got to conform to a rigid format. And I didn't know what to do. I'd never taken a passport picture. So I did the best I possibly could, and then basically the pictures were buried because I was embarrassed about them. But 50 years later, they have a charm and an innocence and a sort of naivety that I felt had a place now. And so I've worked with them, I've colorized them, I've recreated them up to a point and presented them in a completely unique and special way in the exhibition at Snap Galleries. Yeah,
well, they really are super. At one point, Mick Jagger actually turned the camera on you. Was that a usual thing?
He did on the aeroplane going to America. He took a snap of me looking around my seat on my old Nikon, and yes, it's a rather sweet portrait. I look like a baby.
You all do. They were so young then, weren't they? A couple of the pictures you took ended up on album covers. Was that by design or just a sort of happy accident?
I wouldn't call it a happy accident, and I wouldn't call it by design either. I tried to shoot everything as an album cover. I worked with a Hasselblad camera that shot a square format, which gave me the opportunity of looking at everything as though it was a record cover.
Right.
And in those days, the only way that record covers were made were sort of happenstance. somebody would find a picture and say that would make a great cover.
Wow, and they absolutely did, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
Well, it's a fascinating collection. The book of some of these previously unpublished photos is out now. Gered Mankowitz, thanks so much for coming to talk to us about it.
Thank you.